Hello and welcome. Today we will talk about affirmative action, chapter 6. Chapter 6, affirmative action, provides examples of some best practices in the United States as well as in South Africa. Affirmative action describes practical policies and programs that are designed to increase diversity, representation, accessibility, and opportunity for all minority groups that have been disadvantaged or marginalized due to various forms of repression or stereotypes or discriminatory practices in the past. Let us look at the evolution and phases of diversity from the U.S. perspective. Before the 1960s, we had Jim Crow laws or legalized discrimination toward African Americans or Black Americans in the United States. Eventually, the U.S. government and Congress decided to enact certain laws to guarantee equal rights for all American citizens. And then in the 1970s, corporations and organizations focused on providing equal representation of everyone living in their vicinity. So, for example, if we have, let's say, 11% or 12% Black Americans living in a specific city, that means about 10 to 12% of your workforce in that city should be comprised of individuals who are identifying themselves as African or Black Americans. And the same thing would be true of Native Americans, women, and Asians, and other minority groups as well. Well, after the 1970s, many organizations discovered that despite the fact that we had equal rights and perhaps a focus on equal representation, we still have biases, we still have discriminatory practices toward individuals in society and the organization. So many corporations focused on building more effective relationships to take advantage of the diversity. They provided training on interpersonal skills, communication skills, teamwork, and so on. They did discover that diverse teams that did receive good interpersonal training on communication, teamwork, skill building, conflict resolution in other areas were actually outperforming the homogeneous teams. So there was a lot of validity to building stronger relationships among diverse teams in the workplace. Ultimately, the decade of 1990s is set to be the decade where everybody's responsible for their personal behaviors. In other words, it's not just the managers and organizations, but if an employee is discriminatory or derogatory toward another minority person in the workplace, he or she should be either reprimanded, counseled, or terminated, depending on the seriousness of what he or she said or did. So again, anybody who does violate the laws toward individuals or is discriminatory, then he or she should receive punishment for it. Ultimately, the years 2000 and beyond have focused on making diversity a competitive advantage by producing better results as a result of having a diverse workforce that works through fairness, equity, and inclusionary practices. So ultimately, we know that the purpose of diversifying the workforce is not just to have diverse numbers, but to also make that a competitive advantage for the organization and get better results compared to not having that heterogeneous workforce. Professor Shelby Steele of Harvard University wrote that what is needed now is a new spirit of pragmatism in racial matters where disadvantaged minorities are seen simply as American citizens who deserve complete fairness and in some cases developmental assistance, but in no case special entitlement based on their minority status. So affirmative action has been talked about for quite a while over the past 4 or 5 decades in the United States, as well as in places like South Africa. Also, my colleague, Professor Roosevelt Thomas, for example, wrote a really good article in the 1990s entitled From Affirmative Action to Affirming Diversity. So what is affirmative action? Is it still needed? And what benefits can be derived from it? While affirmative action tends to set the stage for a gender blind, a color blind, a culture blind workplace, larger percentages of minorities and women included still tend to stagnate, plateau, or quit when they fail to move up the hierarchy of their organizations. Consequently, everyone's dashed hopes lead to corporate frustration and also a period of being embarrassed and remaining silent about it, which is usually followed by a crisis in more recruitment. This is where we hear about the revolving door syndrome, where minorities are hired into an organization, but because attitudes and discriminatory behaviors are not changed, those individuals tend to leave through the same doors that they came through. So some organizations have repeated this cycle of hiring more and more minorities, but still not taken advantage of true inclusionary practices through equitable and accessible opportunities for all their employees. So we need to measure progress with reality. So it's good to see we have great writers and authors that have written a lot over the past 4 or 5 decades about diversity issues while measuring its progress and the realities that we face in today's environment. Dr. Roosevelt mentioned that there are some problems associated with programs like assimilation. The assimilation model of washing away differences, or the American melting pot, is not really very useful nor valid in today's environment in the American workforce. So companies are faced with the challenge of having to manage unassimilated diversity using strategies that were designed for a homogeneous workforce to earn employee commitment toward quality and high profits. This is why inclusion is said to be one of the best models compared to all the other alternatives. So our challenge is to work not merely toward culture in colorblindness, but also toward an openly multicultural workplace that taps into and energizes the full potential of every worker without artificial programs or standards or barriers. So this can be achieved by learning to understand and modify some of the ineffective organizational assumptions, models, and systems that unfortunately have prevented minorities from rising up the organization's ladder. Keep in mind that affirmative action was premised based on certain assumptions in the 1960s, which were perhaps reality at that time, but since then have changed quite a bit. One of the premises were that adult white males made up majority of the American business mainstream. Another one was that the American economic structure was a solid, unchanging institution with more than enough space for everyone. Another one was women, blacks, immigrants, and other minorities should be allowed into the workplace as a matter of public policy and common decency. And the fact that widespread racial, ethnic, and sexual prejudices kept minorities out of the workplace. And finally, another important premise was that legal and social interventions are necessary to bring about the needed changes in the workplace. The current reality in the United States today is that more than half of the American workforce consists of minorities, immigrants, and women. So the minorities are becoming the majority. White males are becoming a minority as they made up about 15% of the workforce as of the year 2000. And so that number is decreasing each year. Minorities and women no longer need a boarding pass to the workplace, since the major problem is no longer having entry into the workplace. Rather, The major challenge is to make better use of their potential at every level, especially in middle management and top leadership positions. One of the challenges associated with affirmative action is that alone it cannot cope with the challenge of creating a work setting geared to the upward mobility of all people, including white males. So affirmative action is often a red flag to workers who feel unfairly passed over and a stigma for those who appear to be the beneficiaries of such policies at the university environment, at the corporate environment, or at the public sector. Overall, Dr. Roosevelt offered 10 guidelines for learning to manage diversity. And first of all, any organization should clarify the motivation for any of their diversity management or affirmative action programs. Clarify the vision, expand your focus, audit the organization's culture, modify assumptions, modify systems, modify models, help people pioneer. Apply the special test consideration by asking, will the new system actually contribute to everyone's well-being and opportunities, including white males? And finally, continue affirmative action as needed to help those disadvantaged groups in your organization. And sometimes those disadvantaged groups could be white males as they are becoming the minority. So inclusionary practices should be targeting all individuals to provide them an opportunity as needed for your organization. Remember that the purpose of managing diversity has always been and should be to develop everyone's capacity to accept, to incorporate, and to empower the diverse human talent in the organization, in the nation, and eventually in the world, so we can all be as productive as possible as one human race. With regards to affirmative action, in 2023, the Supreme Court of the United States actually had a very, very popular case that had been argued over the past 3 decades several times before. The question was, is race-based affirmative action in college admissions legal? This question had been answered positively in the past. However, in 2023, on June 30th, they made a very different decision this time. So the question that was posed was, is the admission process used by Harvard and University of North Carolina lawful under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? The Supreme Court majority voted that it is not lawful or constitutional to use race in college admission systems. So we had 6 members concurrent with the majority view and 3 dissenting. Consequently, race-based affirmative action in college admission was banned as of June 2023. And by the way, the historical race-based affirmative action that was legal was based on Alan Bach, Barbara Grutter, and also Abigail Noel Fisher 1 and 2 back in 78, 2003, and as well as 2013 and 2016. So the court went against those precedents that had been set over the past 3 decades. Justice Thomas explained that college admissions have become a zero-sum game as Asian students suffer because of an outdated overcorrection, which stems from the 1950s and 1960s. He emphasized that today's youth do not have to and should not shoulder the moral debts of their ancestors. He also mentioned that we must adhere to the promise of equality under the law declared by the Declaration of Independence and codified by the 14th Amendment. However, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, in her dissent, disagreed by saying that the 14th Amendment does not impose a blanket ban on race-conscious policies, and that the Equal Protection Clause permits consideration of race to achieve its goals. Additionally, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson explains that history shows that race-based gaps that first developed centuries ago are echoes from the past that still exists today. Keep in mind that if every person in the United States does not have access to great university education, that means inequality will continue to divide us into have and have nots. So unfortunately, the cycle of oppression will continue unless we are able to provide equality, equity, inclusion, and accessibility to every American. Keep in mind that diversity is both a national as well as an international reality all around the globe, and we must make it our strength as a human race. Chapter also talks about affirmative action in the case of South Africa. There's discussion about the repeal of discriminatory laws, transformation of the South African society, and the introduction of Equal Employment Opportunity Act, also affirmative action integration, and how it has transformed South Africa over the last 3 decades. South Africa is made up of people from diverse ethnicities and cultures. So the more we learn about best practices of affirmative action in South Africa or in North America, the more we can apply them to any nation that needs such opportunities and programs. In terms of population and income, in 1993, Blacks made up about 76% of the population in South Africa, but earned only 29% of the country's total income. Whites, who constituted only about 13% of the population, accounted for 58% of the total income in South Africa. As we know from history of South Africa, the white population demanded the maintenance of the status quo and bolstered their position with threats of a massive exodus to greener pastures with a concomitant brain drain. Whites owned most businesses, and their divestments could have crippled the South African economy. The government of President Nelson Mandela opted for pragmatism in the face of pressure from the right and left extremists. Their policy was driven by the ruling party's declaration that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. So the government of South Africa embraced affirmative action as the only pragmatic policy that could redress imbalances of the past. Ultimately, the government of President Nelson Mandela opted to embrace affirmative action as a vehicle for the transformation of the South African workforce. The policy has been a resounding success in addressing the imbalances of the past. So affirmative action strategies can actually play a very similar role in the transformation of other societies to fair and synergistic economies where people of all ethnicities can be equal partners and contributors. South Africa's Employment Equity Act 55 of 1998 prohibits unfair discrimination, as it states that no person may unfairly discriminate directly or indirectly against an employee in any employment policy or practice on one or more grounds, which can include race, gender, pregnancy, marital status, family responsibility, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, HIV status, conscience, belief, political opinion, culture, language, and birth. So both the Americans and the South Africans have enacted certain laws to guarantee equal rights for their citizens to speed up the process of equity, inclusion for all of their citizens. There are some implications for management in today's work environment. So multinational corporations in the private sector need to familiarize themselves with each country's affirmative action policies. There is a huge reservoir of educated work seekers who need training, equal opportunity, fair performance appraisals, and upward mobility. So minorities should not be ignored because they can make your workplace competitive if they're given the opportunity to perform up to and beyond their abilities and capabilities. South Africa did not embrace quotas. The profitability of industries has not suffered because of the implementation of their affirmative action program. South Africa is the engine of development in sub-Saharan Africa with a growing potential for success. Similar regulations and policies can be helpful in the rebuilding of other diverse nations to ensure equality for all male and female citizens of diverse ethnic backgrounds. When it comes to a diverse work environment, we need to avoid some of the common responses toward those individuals who claim that they have been discriminated against or they have suffered from a daily indignity or an unearned privilege. Sometimes people say, oh, it happens to everybody, don't worry about it. They didn't mean to discriminate against you. Maybe the person is just that way. It's their personality. Maybe they're just rude. They don't mean to discriminate. Or maybe you're just being paranoid. You know, if you look for trouble, you'll find it. So again, we need to avoid these common responses and simply acknowledge the person's statement by what you heard. And if there's anything you can do about it, obviously, hopefully, you can comfort the person and prevent such discriminatory practices in your workplace or in your vicinity by being a cultural ally. Just because you and I cannot relate to what a person is saying does not mean he or she is wrong. So your truth and my truth could be very different. What you see may not necessarily be always what I see because we have two different backgrounds. We have two different histories. We have different years of experience, sometimes different professions and different upbringing. So our communication may not necessarily be effective either. Remember that my experiences and my perception of the reality leads me to my truth. However, your experiences and your perception of the reality leads you to your truth. And often, if you see your truth and you cannot see mine, you automatically assume that mine is wrong. And I would assume the same thing about yours. And this does not have to be the case. Everybody's reality may be very different. We simply need to acknowledge and move on from there, as opposed to providing some common responses like, oh, don't worry about it. You know, maybe they did not mean to discriminate against you. Maybe they're not being hurtful. Maybe they were just trying to help you become a little bit better, etc. Keep in mind that there may be truth in two different perceptions of reality. Refusing to believe there may be truth in someone else's reality is a double indignity. Over time, discriminatory practices such as daily indignities and unearned privileges can affect a person's self-confidence and self-esteem, which affects a person's morale and level of productivity in the workplace. In other words, if daily indignities and unearned privileges continue in the workplace, the person is hard to retain. He or she might go someplace where he or she is treated more inclusively and better. The concept of cycle of oppression tells us that when discrimination happens in one area of a person's life, like housing, for example, it tends to impact his or her education as well as employment opportunities. So there is this interdependence among the various elements in society related to housing, employment, and education. The need for acceptable education, housing, and employment for all sectors of the population represents some of the basic human needs in any society today. These needs are interdependent, and in case of oppression, they comprise a vicious cycle that prevents some minorities from fairly accessing these opportunities that are available to some of us, but not necessarily to all of us. So people need a quality education to obtain satisfying employment that will enable the purchase of housing located in an area with access to schools that would provide a quality education for their young children and offsprings. can break out of the cycle, but some individuals give up trying because they are overwhelmed by the continuation of common responses or discriminatory practices, or they do not know how to proceed since they face many biases and stereotypes on a consistent basis. It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, to accept, and to celebrate those differences, which was mentioned by Audre Lorde. Remember that it's what's inside that makes a difference. In other words, what goes into our heads impact our heart or our feelings, and eventually it impacts our habits or behaviors in the workplace. Remember that through equity and inclusionary practices, you can make diversity an advantage for you, your team, and your organization, and your society, whether you are in the United States or in South Africa or any other place in the world. Good luck being inclusionary and achieving synergistic results.